Francis Bacon was born on January 22, 1561, in London, during a period of profound political and intellectual transformation in England. His birth into the household of Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal under Queen Elizabeth I, and Lady and Cook Bacon, one of the most learned women of her time, placed him at the crossroads of privilege and intellectual rigor. From an early age, Bacon was surrounded by the pulse of political affairs and the currency of ideas, elements that would shape the trajectory of his life and thought. The environment in which Bacon was raised was uniquely conducive to the cultivation of an inquisitive mind. His father, deeply involved in the administration of the Tudor state, ensured that his son was exposed to the workings of government and diplomacy. His mother, fluent in multiple classical languages and an active correspondent with major Protestant reformers, instilled in young Francis a respect for learning and a familiarity with classical texts. In this household, knowledge was not merely ornamental but instrumental, a tool for influence and transformation. Bacon's precocity was evident early on. At the age of 12, he was admitted to Trinity College, Cambridge, an unusually young age even by the standards of the time. His years at Cambridge, 1573 to 1575, proved formative, though not altogether satisfying. He quickly grew critical of the dominant Aristotelianism that permeated the university curriculum. For Bacon, the scholastic reverence for deductive reasoning and untested assumptions seemed to hinder, rather than advance, the cause of knowledge. These frustrations sowed the first seeds of his later critique of classical philosophy and his advocacy for empirical investigation. Though only a teenager during his time at Cambridge, Bacon already demonstrated a critical independence of thought. He recognized that inherited wisdom, no matter how venerated, needed to be scrutinized rather than accepted on authority. He would later describe this intellectual inertia as the product of idols, false notions that obstruct the mind's path to truth. While these critiques would be formally expressed decades later in his philosophical works, the experiences at Cambridge gave them their first shape. After his studies at Cambridge, Bacon was sent to Gray's Inn in London to study law. This legal training, while practical, did not quell his deeper fascination with the nature of knowledge. Legal reasoning offered structure and rhetorical skill, but Bacon perceived its limitations when applied to broader questions about nature, society, and truth. His legal studies were complemented by his enduring interest in the sciences, politics, and philosophy, interests that he never treated as mutually exclusive. In 1576, Bacon traveled to France as part of the English diplomatic mission, serving under Sir Amias Powlett. His time abroad, cut short by the sudden death of his father in 1579, was another crucial stage in his intellectual maturation. In France, he was exposed to continental political systems, humanist circles, and a more experimental approach to statecraft and learning. This exposure broadened his horizons and offered concrete examples of how ideas could influence the practical realities of governance and diplomacy. The untimely death of Sir Nicholas Bacon dramatically altered the course of Francis's life. With his inheritance diminished, he was compelled to pursue a career more actively, often out of financial necessity rather than philosophical choice. This shift in fortune, however, did not dampen his intellectual ambition. On the contrary, it gave Bacon an acute awareness of the relationship between knowledge and power, a theme that would recur throughout his life. Despite the obstacles, Bacon remained steadfast in his vision of reforming learning. He began to articulate a philosophy that stood in opposition to scholasticism and medieval traditions. While he had not yet produced his major works, the framework for his later philosophy was already in place. a conviction that true knowledge required not only observation, but also a systematic method of discovery grounded in experience and reason. Throughout his early years, Bacon exhibited a rare blend of practical engagement and philosophical aspiration. He did not retreat into the ivory tower of academia, nor did he surrender to the political expediencies of court life. Instead, he sought to bridge these worlds, believing that a reformed method of inquiry could serve both individual enlightenment and collective progress. His formative years, therefore, were not merely a prelude to later achievements, but the crucible in which his intellectual identity was forged. The corridors of Elizabethan and Jacobean power were densely woven with ambition, allegiance, and calculated maneuvering. Into this intricate web stepped Francis Bacon, armed not only with legal training and intellectual insight, but with a keen understanding of the role that influence played in governance. From the outset of his career, Bacon displayed a careful sensitivity to the political tides, knowing well that survival, let alone ascent, demanded more than just brilliance. Bacon's initial steps into public service were modest. After completing his legal studies, he began to practice law and was elected to Parliament in 1584 as a representative for Melcombe Regis. Though only in his early 20s, Bacon's oratorical skill and clarity of thought set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He was articulate, composed, and notably rational, often tempering his arguments with an appeal to the common good rather than partisan advantage. Despite his talents, Bacon's early political career was riddled with frustration. His repeated petitions for a significant court appointment were met with hesitation, largely due to his precarious financial situation and his lack of powerful patrons. Yet, his persistence and adaptability would prove essential in a landscape where merit often bowed to lineage and favor. He understood the delicate balance between loyalty and utility in the eyes of the crown. It was during the waning years of Queen Elizabeth I's reign that Bacon began to find a more secure footing. He cultivated connections with influential courtiers, most notably the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. This alliance initially promised much. Essex saw in Bacon a brilliant counselor, while Bacon viewed Essex as a potential conduit to royal favor. However, Bacon's political instincts were always guided by a pragmatic realism. When Essex fell from grace due to his rebellion against the Queen, Bacon did not follow him into disgrace. Rather, he aligned himself with the interests of the state. This decision drew criticism from those who believed Bacon had betrayed a friend, but from another angle, it reflected his consistent prioritization of public duty over personal loyalty. For Bacon, allegiance to the stability of the realm and to the pursuit of justice transcended the emotional pull of individual relationships. His role in Essex's trial, while painful, underscored his commitment to legal order, even when it demanded personal sacrifice. The transition from Elizabeth I to James I in 1603 proved to be a turning point in Bacon's fortunes. The new monarch favored scholarly minds and was receptive to advisors who combined intellect with governance. Under James's patronage, Bacon's career accelerated. He was knighted in 1603, and within a few years, he became Solicitor General, then Attorney General, and finally, in 1617, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, one of the most powerful positions in the realm. In 1618, he was elevated further to the role of Lord Chancellor, the pinnacle of legal and political authority in England. His rise was not merely symbolic. As Lord Chancellor, Bacon wielded substantial influence over legal policy and court affairs. He used this office to advocate for judicial reform, pushing for more efficiency, transparency, and accessibility in legal procedures. He viewed the law not as a static set of rules, but as a living institution that should evolve to meet the needs of society. As he grew in power, Bacon also demonstrated a vision for governance rooted in rationality and order. He supported the strengthening of centralized authority, not out of a desire for autocracy, but from a belief that the state should function as a coherent body led by reason and guided by a structured hierarchy. He saw corruption, ignorance, and factionalism as the chief enemies of good governance, and he endeavored to combat these wherever possible. Yet, despite the outward success of his political ascent, Bacon's position was never entirely secure. The court remained a volatile arena, rife with envy and intrigue. His assertive reforms and unwavering belief in the superiority of reason often clashed with the interests of the nobility and rival factions. Though he was a master of diplomacy and restraint, the very qualities that made him effective as a statesman also made him vulnerable to resentment and resistance. The height of Francis Bacon's power, marked by his tenure as Lord Chancellor, would prove to be as precarious as it was prestigious. His rise had been steep, but the political landscape of early 17th century England was fickle, and the very systems Bacon had sought to refine were the ones that would eventually turn against him. His fall from grace was not just a personal catastrophe. It was a moment that exposed the fragility of merit in a court still governed by rivalry and influence. The early years of Bacon's chancellorship were marked by genuine efforts at reform. He had pushed for more equitable legal procedures and had attempted to speed up the often glacial pace of the English courts. However, these reforms did little to endear him to those who benefited from the old systems of privilege and delay. Moreover, Bacon's meticulous nature and philosophical disposition made him a less than adept court politician in times of growing unrest. As tensions mounted between the monarchy and Parliament, he found himself increasingly isolated. By 1621, murmurs of discontent had grown into formal accusations. Bacon was charged with accepting bribes in his capacity as Lord Chancellor, a grave offense in a role meant to embody impartial justice. Though the practice of gift-giving to officials was common at the time and often operated in a gray zone of etiquette rather than corruption, the charges against Bacon were specific and politically potent. His enemies in Parliament, eager to assert authority over royal appointments, seized upon the moment to make an example of him. The investigation was swift, public, and humiliating. Bacon, recognizing the power of the tide turning against him, did not resist the charges. He confessed to accepting gifts, but maintained that they had not influenced his judgments. Whether his confession was born of guilt, pragmatism, or a sense of fatalism remains debated, but what followed was devastating. He was stripped of all public offices, fined £40,000, and imprisoned briefly in the Tower of London, though his sentence was largely symbolic and later commuted by the king. The emotional and intellectual toll of the scandal was profound. For a man who had spent his life advocating for reason, reform, and justice, to be accused of violating the very principles he championed was both ironic and tragic. Yet Bacon, ever the philosopher, did not allow disgrace to silence him. In retreat from public life, he turned inward, redirecting his energy toward reflection and writing, a return to the realm of ideas that had always been his sanctuary. The fall provided Bacon with a clarity that public life had obscured. Free from the burdens of office, he could now give full expression to his philosophical vision. He described his downfall not only as a political event, but as a necessary humbling, an opportunity to reassess the limits of power and the frailty of human institutions. In his letters and later writings, a tone of measured resignation emerges, not of bitterness, but of renewed purpose. Bacon's reflections after his fall reveal a man deeply aware of human imperfection, He neither portrayed himself as a martyr nor sought to shift the blame. Instead, he seemed to accept his role in the web of political transactions, even as he sought to draw broader lessons from the experience. His introspection, far from diminishing his legacy, added a layer of humanity and complexity to a figure often mythologized for his intellect. Interestingly, it was during this period of disgrace that some of Bacon's most enduring philosophical works came to fruition. Removed from the clamor of courtly duties, he focused on synthesizing his thoughts on knowledge, science, and the future of human progress. His political fall, paradoxically, became a catalyst for intellectual flourishing. It was as though, having lost the world, he was now free to contemplate how to change it. The court may have closed its doors to Bacon, but the world of ideas embraced him more fully than ever. His writings from this period are infused with a sense of urgency and clarity, sharpened by the pain of exile, but brightened by a new sense of purpose. No longer concerned with titles or favors, he could finally devote himself to the task he had long imagined: the reconstruction of learning, rooted in observation, guided by method, and aimed at the improvement of humanity. In the quiet aftermath of political disgrace, Francis Bacon retreated not into obscurity, but into the fertile ground of philosophical inquiry. What emerged from this period was not just a man redeemed through thought, but a method reborn from centuries of stagnant intellectual tradition. Central to this intellectual revival was Novum Organum, published in 1620, a title deliberately chosen to challenge the Aristotelian organon, which had long dominated Western thinking. With this work, Bacon sought to dismantle old structures of knowledge and erect a new edifice based not on speculation, but on experience. The Novum Organum was more than a philosophical treatise. It was a manifesto for a revolution of the mind. At its core was Bacon's assertion that the traditional reliance on syllogism and deduction had failed to deliver meaningful discoveries about the natural world. He proposed instead an inductive method, the patient accumulation of data through observation and experimentation, followed by generalization. For Bacon, the senses, though fallible, were the gateway to truth when guided by careful and systematic inquiry. This inductive method did not promise immediate or absolute certainty. Rather, it embraced the complexity of nature and the limits of human understanding. Bacon did not pretend to know all the answers. Instead, he offered a method by which humanity might find the answers, slowly, progressively, through the structured exploration of empirical reality. This was a radical departure from the belief that truth could be deduced from first principles or inherited wisdom alone. Bacon's critique of traditional learning was sharp. He identified what he called the idols of the mind, systemic errors that distorted human understanding. These included the idols of the tribe, inherent human biases, the idols of the cave, personal prejudices, the idols of the marketplace, miscommunication through language, and the idols of the theater, philosophical dogmas and illusions. By categorizing these obstacles, Bacon aimed to help thinkers cleanse their minds of deception and approach the world with disciplined curiosity. What made Bacon's vision so powerful was not merely its content, but its clarity. He wrote in a tone that combined urgency with humility, conviction with caution. He did not claim that the Novum Organum was a completed doctrine, but rather a beginning of a beginning. This acknowledgement of process over perfection distinguished his method from the rigid systems of the past. Knowledge, in Bacon's vision, was not static but dynamic, always expanding, always self-correcting. The implications of Bacon's method rippled beyond philosophy into the heart of science. Though the term scientific method would not come into general use until much later, Bacon's ideas were foundational in shaping its principles. His emphasis on observation, documentation, and incremental hypothesis building laid the groundwork for empirical research that would define the scientific revolution. Figures such as Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and later the Royal Society would explicitly draw inspiration from Bacon's approach. Importantly, Bacon saw knowledge as a tool for improving the human condition. He envisioned a future where scientific discovery would lead to better health, agriculture, technology, and governance. His goal was not knowledge for its own sake, but for the practical benefit of society. In this way, his method was not just a philosophical innovation, it was a social project aimed at human empowerment. While the Novum Organum was not universally accepted during Bacon's lifetime, it marked a crucial turning point in the history of ideas. It signaled the shift from passive acceptance of authority to active engagement with the natural world. In this transformation, Bacon was not merely a contributor, but a catalyst, challenging scholars to rethink not only what they knew, but how they knew it. The method also reflected Bacon's broader worldview, one of cautious optimism. He believed that human reason, if properly directed, could overcome ignorance and superstition. But he also warned of overconfidence and the temptation to leap to conclusions. His method was, in essence, a call for intellectual discipline, an insistence that progress could only come through careful labor, not flashes of insight or reliance on dogma. As the flames of political ambition dimmed behind him, Francis Bacon turned with unwavering intensity toward a far greater ambition: the transformation of society through the systematic advancement of knowledge. For Bacon, learning was not a private indulgence, nor an elite pastime. It was the engine of civilization itself. To him, the true worth of knowledge lay not in its elegance or abstraction, but in its capacity to produce tangible benefits: better crops, improved health, new inventions, and social harmony. His was a vision in which science was harnessed not only to understand the world, but to remake it for the better. Bacon's oft-quoted maxim, "Knowledge is power," was not merely a slogan. It encapsulated a philosophy that redefined the relationship between thought and action. In his view, nature was not something to be worshipped from afar or speculated about in idle contemplation. It was a domain to be studied rigorously, understood methodically, and ultimately shaped to serve humanity. This idea was revolutionary in a time when many still saw nature as divine, unchangeable, or beyond human influence. His commitment to this transformative potential found one of its most vivid expressions in the New Atlantis, a fictional narrative describing a utopian island governed by enlightened scientists and scholars. The island's central institution, Salomon's House, was a proto-research laboratory, a vision of the ideal scientific community. It was a place where discovery was organized, where experiments were systematically conducted, and where new technologies were developed for the good of the people. This imagined society stood as a model for what Bacon believed the real world could strive toward. Bacon envisioned a future in which science would be institutionalized and collaborative, no longer the domain of isolated thinkers, but of well-supported, coordinated bodies of inquiry. This was a bold departure from the individualism that had defined the Renaissance model of genius. He believed that progress depended on collective effort, funded and protected by the state, and directed toward goals that would uplift the human condition. In this sense, he was not only a philosopher of science, but one of the earliest advocates for publicly supported research. The practical uses of science fascinated him. He imagined machines that could ease labor, medicines that could prolong life, and instruments that could extend the senses, telescopes, microscopes, and other tools that would allow humanity to pierce deeper into the mysteries of the world. He anticipated the application of knowledge in agriculture, navigation, engineering, and urban planning. His descriptions, though sometimes speculative, reflected a deep and prescient understanding of how discovery and innovation might shape the fabric of everyday life. What set Bacon apart from other thinkers of his time was his unwavering belief in the moral responsibility of knowledge. He feared that without ethical guidance, science could become corrupt, manipulated by greed or ambition. To this end, he argued that science must be directed by public interest, grounded in virtue, and protected from political or personal misuse. Knowledge divorced from morality, in Bacon's view, was not only dangerous but antithetical to its true purpose. This ethical dimension extended to his views on education. Bacon believed that learning should not be confined to the aristocracy or cloistered within the walls of universities. He called for educational reform that would expand access to knowledge and promote critical thinking across all social classes. In doing so, he hoped to cultivate a citizenry that could participate in and benefit from scientific progress. His dream was an enlightened public, guided by reason and empowered by understanding. The idea of progress itself, linear, cumulative, and potentially limitless, was another cornerstone of Bacon's vision. At a time when many still viewed history as cyclical or decline-oriented, Bacon proposed that humanity could climb a ladder of continuous improvement through science. This belief would later underpin the Enlightenment, industrialization, and modern notions of innovation. It was an extraordinary leap of imagination to suggest that the future could be better than the past, and that knowledge was the key to unlocking that future. However, Bacon's vision was not naive. He was fully aware of the obstacles that stood in the way of scientific advancement: superstition, tradition, institutional resistance, and the inertia of ignorance. Yet, he faced these barriers with persistent optimism. His writings are suffused with the sense that the transformation of society through knowledge was not only possible, but inevitable, provided humanity had the courage to pursue it with integrity and discipline. Through all his efforts, Bacon did not see himself as the culmination of knowledge, but as a harbinger. He imagined future generations building upon his foundations, refining his methods, correcting his errors, and achieving results he could scarcely envision. In this, he was perhaps most modern of all, a thinker who understood that the true power of knowledge lies not in the present, but in the promise of what is yet to come. While Francis Bacon's name is most commonly associated with philosophy and science, his literary prowess is equally vital to understanding his enduring influence. Beyond the rigor of Novum Organum or the utopian imagery of the New Atlantis, Bacon crafted a body of work that shaped English prose in profound ways. His essays, in particular, remain some of the most admired and quoted pieces of reflective writing in the English language, exemplifying a style that was as deliberate as it was compact. First published in 1597 and later expanded in subsequent editions, Bacon's essays marked a new form of writing in English letters, one that was concise, meditative, and ethically grounded. Each essay tackled a distinct theme: truth, ambition, marriage, revenge, friendship, death. These were not abstract musings, but carefully constructed reflections on practical and moral life. Bacon approached each topic with the eye of a statesman and the soul of a philosopher, offering his observations with aphoristic precision. What distinguished Bacon's essays from his contemporaries' writings was their brevity and their balance. He eschewed elaborate ornamentation for pith and potency. A single sentence might contain layers of meaning, capable of sparking thought far beyond its simple phrasing. His language was never flowery, but always deliberate, chosen to provoke rather than to impress. Reading mocketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man, he famously wrote, summarizing his view of intellectual discipline with startling economy. In style, Bacon was a bridge between the eloquence of the Renaissance and the clarity sought by the Enlightenment. He combined the poetic sensibility of a writer like Montaigne with the rational edge of a reformer. Unlike Montaigne, however, Bacon's essays were not confessional or personal. They were analytical, almost clinical. He did not write to explore his own thoughts, but to illuminate patterns in human nature. The result was a kind of moral geometry, each essay structured like a theorem about how people act, succeed, or fail. His essay of Truth opens with a haunting image of Pilate asking, "What is truth?" but not waiting for an answer. This rhetorical move signals Bacon's understanding that truth, though vital, is often evaded or distorted in the affairs of men. Elsewhere, in Of Studies, he outlines the uses and dangers of reading and learning, warning that books are not to be swallowed whole, but chewed and digested thoughtfully. Such passages demonstrate Bacon's ability to blend moral insight with worldly wisdom. Bacon's work also reflects a keen psychological awareness. He had observed court politics and human behavior from the inside, and his essays are rich with the insights of experience. He knew the subtleties of flattery, the dangers of envy, the burden of power. Rather than moralize from a distance, he dissected these themes with an almost surgical detachment. His tone was cool, reasoned, and pragmatic, not sentimental, but deeply aware of the human condition. The prose in Bacon's essays also established a standard for persuasive writing in English. His use of parallel structures, antithesis, and rhetorical questions gave his work a rhythm that made it memorable and compelling. "If a man will begin with certainties," he wrote, "he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties." Sentences like these were not just elegant. They encapsulated whole philosophies in a turn of phrase. Beyond his essays, Bacon also contributed to English legal and political literature. His History of the Reign of King Henry VII was a pioneering attempt at historical narrative grounded in analysis rather than legend. Though it lacked the emotional sweep of later historical works, it introduced a model of history as the study of causes and consequences, not merely events. His language here remained lucid and measured, intended for instruction more than entertainment. His literary output extended to his Latin writings as well. Bacon believed that Latin was the language of intellectual permanence and translated many of his works into it, or commissioned translations, so that they might reach a broader European audience. Yet, even in Latin, his clarity of thought and structure remained evident. It was a mark of his dual ambition, to influence both the present and the future, both his countrymen and the learned world abroad. Francis Bacon's intellectual reach did not go uncontested in his own time, nor in the generations that followed. While his name became synonymous with empirical inquiry and the transformation of learning, his ideas stirred debate, skepticism, and even resistance. The intellectual world of the late 16th and early 17th centuries was not unified by a single vision of knowledge. It was a landscape of competing systems in which Bacon's empiricism had to jostle against metaphysics, scholasticism, mysticism, and the nascent mechanistic philosophies of Europe. Among Bacon's most prominent contemporaries were figures like René Descartes and Galileo Galilei, men who, while also seen as founders of modern science, followed quite different paths from Bacon. Descartes, for example, championed a method of radical doubt and deduction, beginning with the certainty of self-awareness. In contrast to Bacon's gradual accumulation of empirical evidence, Descartes proposed that reason alone could build knowledge from foundational truths. Their methods diverged so sharply that later thinkers often placed them at opposite poles. Bacon as the champion of induction, Descartes of deduction. Despite these differences, Bacon and Descartes shared a common aim: the renovation of knowledge. But where Bacon distrusted metaphysical speculation, Descartes embraced it. Where Bacon sought truths in nature's complexity, Descartes preferred the clarity of mathematical reasoning. This divergence did not go unnoticed by their readers, and throughout the Enlightenment, debates raged over whose method better served the new science. Galileo, another of Bacon's contemporaries, embodied a more empirical spirit akin to Bacon's, but even he did not follow Bacon's method in full. Galileo's genius lay in his fusion of observation and mathematical description, particularly in physics and astronomy. He performed experiments, to be sure, but also relied on idealized conditions and mathematical elegance, qualities Bacon did not emphasize. While Bacon called for broad-based experimental research, Galileo narrowed his focus to specific problems in motion and mechanics, thereby advancing science through a different lens. Beyond these great names, Bacon encountered resistance from the still powerful academic establishments of his day, especially within the universities of England and the broader European continent. The Aristotelianism entrenched in scholastic curricula saw Bacon's empirical philosophy as reductive or even dangerous. Professors who had long relied on deductive argumentation drawn from ancient texts resisted the idea that truth could be drawn from muddy fields or bubbling beakers rather than clean syllogisms. Bacon's emphasis on utility and experimentation was also met with skepticism by traditional philosophers who saw his pragmatism as lacking metaphysical depth. To them, Bacon was too focused on method and not enough on meaning. His scientific optimism, his belief that knowledge could endlessly improve human life, was dismissed by some as naive or even hubristic. For these critics, science, unmoored from philosophical reflection, risked becoming a tool of manipulation rather than understanding. Within England, Bacon's political and personal reputation further complicated his intellectual legacy. His fall from political grace cast a long shadow, and some contemporaries saw his writings on morality and governance as tainted by hypocrisy. The irony of a man preaching ethical renewal while accepting bribes as Lord Chancellor did not escape his detractors. These critiques, whether fair or exaggerated, made some wary of his moral authority even as they acknowledged his intellectual brilliance. Yet, Bacon also found champions, especially among the rising class of natural philosophers. The formation of the Royal Society in 1660, just decades after his death, marked a turning point in how his ideas were received. The Society's founders explicitly cited Bacon as a guiding light, praising his vision of organized, collaborative, and experiment-driven science. They echoed his call for knowledge that served the public good and embraced his wariness of hasty generalizations. In them, Bacon found the disciples he had long hoped for but did not fully see in his lifetime. Even with growing admiration, later philosophers continued to critique and refine Bacon's legacy. Thinkers such as David Hume questioned the certainty of inductive reasoning, pointing out that generalizing from experience could never guarantee truth. Karl Popper, centuries later, would argue for falsifiability over Bacon's steady accumulation of data. In their critiques, they acknowledged Bacon's foundational role, even as they sought to correct or evolve the method he had introduced. The corridors of English power in the early 17th century were narrow and unforgiving. marked by shifting alliances, royal favor, and a dangerous game of courtly politics. Francis Bacon, who had ascended through these very passages with remarkable ambition and skill, eventually found himself ensnared by the very forces he once sought to master. His fall from political grace was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a dramatic unraveling of a public life shaped by ideals, strategy, and the fragile promise of royal patronage. Bacon's position as Lord Chancellor, the highest legal office in the kingdom, placed him at the heart of the English legal and political system. Appointed in 1618 by King James I, Bacon was tasked with overseeing the chancery, presiding over legal matters of equity, and ensuring that justice was administered in line with both law and conscience. For a time, he appeared the embodiment of enlightened governance, erudite, judicious, and fiercely devoted to order. Yet behind the scenes, the political climate was becoming increasingly treacherous. The early 1620s brought growing discontent within Parliament and among the aristocracy. Disputes over royal finances, taxation, and favoritism created a volatile atmosphere in which public officials were scrutinized with unprecedented intensity. Bacon, despite his accomplishments, was not insulated from the rising tide of suspicion. As Lord Chancellor, he was held accountable for the court's integrity, and rumors began to surface about improprieties in his administration, particularly allegations of bribery in judicial proceedings. In 1621, Parliament launched a formal investigation into corruption across government offices, and Bacon quickly became a central figure in the inquiry. Evidence accumulated that litigants had paid him gifts before or after judgments in their favor. Although Bacon defended himself by claiming these payments had not influenced his decisions, and that the practice, while questionable, was not uncommon at the time, the charges struck a blow to his reputation and his office. The public, already disillusioned by political excess, demanded accountability. Pressed by political forces and aware that resisting would only deepen his disgrace, Bacon admitted to the charges. He submitted a formal confession to the House of Lords, acknowledging his guilt and accepting bribes and expressing deep remorse. His defense was laced with humility. "I have been the justest judge that hath been in England these 50 years, he declared, but it was the justest censure in Parliament that was these 200 years. These words, whether sincere or strategic, seal the paradox of a man known for wisdom, now humbled by personal failure. The sentence handed down was severe, though ultimately softened by royal intervention. Bacon was fined, imprisoned in the Tower of London, albeit briefly, barred from holding office, and prohibited from coming within the court's vicinity. The disgrace was public and symbolic. A man once seen as the rational voice of the crown was now cast as a cautionary tale of ambition undone by ethical lapse. Though King James later intervened to ease the punishment, Bacon's political career was effectively ended. His fall had a chilling effect on other office holders, sending a message that no rank was immune from scrutiny. It also sparked broader debates about the boundaries between private gain and public duty. The nature of corruption, once cloaked in customary gift-giving and informal exchanges, came under sharper definition in the shadow of Bacon's scandal. His case helped initiate a cultural shift in how legal and political integrity were judged, even as many questioned whether the scapegoating of one man truly cleansed the system. Bacon himself retreated from public life with a combination of bitterness and philosophical reflection. Though broken politically, he was not silenced intellectually. In letters and reflections composed after his fall, he meditated on his condition with a mixture of stoicism and resignation. He described his punishment as the pain of my heart, the wound of my reputation. Yet he also saw it as a turning point, a redirection from public affairs to deeper intellectual pursuits. What makes Bacon's fall particularly poignant is that it stands in stark contrast to the principles he espoused in his writings. The advocate of empirical truth, ethical governance, and public utility was brought down by personal failings within the very structures he had hoped to reform. His downfall was not the result of intellectual error, but of the old moral contradiction between knowledge and conduct. In Bacon's story, the idealism of the thinker clashed with the compromises of the courtier. After his fall from political grace, Francis Bacon entered a markedly different phase of life, one shaped not by ambition or power, but by solitude, study, and a quietly burning intellectual persistence. No longer burdened by courtly obligations or administrative responsibilities, he turned inward, devoting his remaining years to reflection and the unfinished projects that had long occupied his mind. Far from being silenced by scandal, Bacon grew even more productive in exile, seeking redemption not through reputation but through the written word. He withdrew to the relative quiet of his estate at Gorhambury, surrounded by books, manuscripts, and a small circle of loyal assistants. The rhythm of his days shifted toward contemplation, dictated by health and weather rather than the clockwork of state. Here, in the English countryside, Bacon returned to the work that had always most deeply animated him, the reformation of knowledge. He revisited his great intellectual schemes, refining them, expanding them, and preparing their fragments for posthumous publication. Despite the blow to his public standing, Bacon did not wallow in despair. Letters from the time reveal a tone not of bitterness, but of resignation tinged with purpose. He accepted his fate as the price of ambition and saw in it a providential redirection. "My business is not to flatter or follow men," he wrote in a letter, "but to lay the foundation of a better understanding of nature and of human affairs." Even in disgrace, he believed in the enduring value of his intellectual mission. During these years, Bacon completed and revised key texts that would become essential to his legacy. Among them was New Atlantis, a philosophical romance that portrayed an ideal society built upon scientific institutions. The fictional island of Ben Salem, home to the majestic House of Salomon, stood as a dream of what organized, collaborative knowledge could achieve. Though incomplete, the work embodied Bacon's hope that humanity might one day escape ignorance through systematic inquiry and collective effort. He also continued to refine Silva Silvarum, a sprawling collection of natural observations and experimental curiosities. While the work lacked the methodological rigor of his earlier philosophical treatises, it showcased his enduring curiosity about the world. Whether cataloging the effects of cold on living organisms or speculating on the movement of tides, Bacon treated nature not as a passive backdrop, but as an open book filled with puzzles. His writing, though often fragmentary, teemed with vitality and wonder. Yet Bacon's health was steadily deteriorating. Years of labor, political stress, and the emotional toll of disgrace had weakened him. He suffered recurrent respiratory problems and periods of fatigue that interrupted his work. Nevertheless, he continued to dictate thoughts, draft essays, and correspond with fellow scholars. He never stopped writing. Knowledge, he believed, was a form of immortality, a legacy that could outlive the body, transcending even the worst personal ruin. His death, when it came in 1626, was as curious and symbolic as the life that preceded it. According to one widely told account, Bacon had ventured out in snowy weather to test a theory about refrigeration. He purchased a chicken, stuffed it with snow to observe the effects of cold on preservation, and soon afterward fell ill with pneumonia. The story, though perhaps apocryphal, captured the imagination of those who saw in it a poetic ending, the philosopher dying in the act of experimentation. Bacon passed away on April 9th, 1626, at the home of the Earl of Arundel. His final days were marked not by grandeur, but by quiet reflection. He left behind no heirs, no enduring political faction, and no monument at court. What he did leave was a mountain of manuscripts, a constellation of ideas, and a body of work that would shape the evolution of science, ethics, and governance for centuries. His vision of knowledge as power, and of power as something to be used wisely, endured long after his breath had ceased. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Bacon's reputation remained mixed. To some, he was still the disgraced courtier, the man whose ambitions had outstripped his virtue. To others, he was the prophet of a new intellectual age, a modern-day Prometheus who had offered humanity the fire of scientific reason. Over time, the latter view gained ascendancy. His writings continued to circulate, inspiring thinkers across Europe to adopt more rigorous, empirical approaches to the study of nature. The final years of Francis Bacon's life thus form a paradox, a time of personal withdrawal, yet philosophical expansion, of physical decline, yet intellectual vitality. Stripped of worldly power, he clung more fiercely to the enduring force of ideas. He did not seek vindication through title or influence, but through the pages he left behind. In retreat, he found clarity. In silence, he found voice. In the narrowing of his world, he carved a path toward the broad horizon of posterity. The death of Francis Bacon in 1626 did not mark the end of his intellectual journey. If anything, it was the beginning of a far-reaching influence that would ripple across generations, reshaping the trajectory of science, philosophy, and even politics. Bacon's ideas, though grounded in his own era, transcended time and geography, laying the groundwork for the development of modern thought. His legacy, though once clouded by scandal, would grow to be synonymous with the very idea of intellectual progress. The immediate reaction to Bacon's death was a mixture of admiration and skepticism. In England, his personal disgrace tempered the more enthusiastic praises of his ideas. His downfall from the lofty position of Lord Chancellor left some hesitant to fully embrace his intellectual reforms. Yet, despite these reservations, Bacon's works continued to circulate, and soon they found an eager audience across Europe. His vision for a systematic, experimental approach to knowledge resonated with thinkers who sought to break free from the constraints of medieval scholasticism and theological dogma. It was in the following decades that Bacon's influence began to crystallize. The rise of the Royal Society in the mid-17th century, an institution dedicated to the advancement of scientific knowledge through empirical methods, was one of the most significant legacies of Bacon's thought. Founded in 1660, the Royal Society explicitly aligned itself with Baconian principles. The institution's motto, Nullius in verba, meaning take nobody's word for it, echoed Bacon's insistence on empirical evidence and the rejection of unverified authority. In many ways, the Society was the living embodiment of Bacon's call for science to be grounded in observation, experimentation, and rational inquiry. Bacon's influence spread beyond the shores of England. In the 17th century, the philosophical underpinnings of the scientific revolution, laid by figures such as Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, were intertwined with Bacon's empirical methodology. Isaac Newton, perhaps the most famous figure of the scientific revolution, was deeply influenced by Bacon's notion that the universe could be understood through systematic study and that nature itself could be interpreted as a kind of text, waiting to be deciphered. Newton's Principia Mathematica built upon the Baconian legacy of observation, experimentation, and the application of mathematics to the natural world. Bacon's influence also found its way into the works of later philosophers such as John Locke and George Berkeley. Locke, who shared Bacon's distrust of abstract metaphysical speculation, emphasized empirical observation and the collection of sensory data as the foundation of knowledge. In an essay concerning human understanding, Locke expounded upon the idea that human knowledge arises from experience, an idea that was very much in line with Bacon's inductive reasoning. Locke's theories on the nature of knowledge became foundational for the philosophy of empiricism, and Bacon was, without question, one of his intellectual forebears. As the Enlightenment progressed, Bacon's legacy became increasingly central to the development of modern science and philosophy. The Enlightenment thinkers, particularly those in France, were captivated by his ideas. Voltaire, for instance, praised Bacon for his emphasis on the empirical method and his contribution to human progress. Bacon was seen as a harbinger of the scientific worldview, a figure whose commitment to reason, evidence, and experimentation symbolized the best of human intellectual capacity. However, while Bacon's influence in the world of philosophy and science grew, it was not without its challenges. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, critics began to reassess Bacon's approach to knowledge. Figures like Karl Popper questioned the assumptions underlying Bacon's inductive method, arguing that scientific knowledge was never certain, but instead built upon falsifiable hypotheses. Despite this, Bacon's central place in the development of modern science remained secure. His influence on the methodology of inquiry, on how we seek knowledge, analyze data, and form conclusions, remained profound, even as its practical applications were refined. In the political realm, Bacon's vision of knowledge and governance was also influential. His ideas about the role of science in improving society continued to resonate with thinkers interested in social reform and political innovation. The notion that scientific progress could lead to human betterment was an enduring ideal in both the intellectual and political movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. Bacon's idea of natural philosophy, where science served the common good, found expression in various reformist ideologies that championed public health, technological advancement, and environmental sustainability. Even into the 20th century, Bacon's thought remained a touchstone for scientific and philosophical inquiry. The rise of the scientific method in popular discourse, with its emphasis on observation, experimentation, and empirical validation, owed much to Bacon's vision. In many ways, Bacon's insistence that knowledge should be both practical and beneficial to humanity prefigured the modern ideal of science as a tool for solving real-world problems. The 21st century continues to witness the evolution of Baconian principles, even in areas beyond traditional science. Fields such as psychology, sociology, and even artificial intelligence now adopt Bacon's empirical approach, seeking to gather data, test hypotheses, and refine theories. His call for collaboration and the sharing of knowledge resonates with a globalized scientific community that works to solve pressing issues like climate change, pandemics, and energy crises. Bacon's intellectual legacy has, therefore, endured because it encapsulated a vision of human potential that transcended his own limitations. His method of inquiry, grounded in the material world and guided by empirical evidence, helped usher in a new era of intellectual exploration. Bacon's death did not mark the end of his influence. Rather, it solidified his place as one of the architects of the modern world. His dreams of a more enlightened, reasoned society, one built on the foundation of knowledge, have continued to inspire thinkers, scientists, and leaders for centuries.